Hey everyone, our topic this week in KNR 455 is financial feasibility. So let's get right into it. Why do we need to discuss this topic of financial feasibility in sport finance? Well, I think it helps to start off by just defining this term. So a feasibility study is a study conducted to determine whether a project is likely to be sensible and successful. All right, so understanding this terminology is important for kind of justifying the importance of it in the sport industry. Feasibility studies are very commonly used across our field to do exactly as the definition states, right? To essentially gauge whether or not a particular project might be sensible or successful if it is seen through. So, some common uses in the sport industry: should a city build a professional sports stadium or arena? They conduct a feasibility study in order to determine if that's, a financially sound thing to do. Should a university athletic department add a sport program? Another perfect situation where you might conduct a feasibility study. Should a metropolitan area try to lure a sports team to their town? Another great opportunity to conduct a feasibility study. And then finally, should a city bid to host a major sporting event like the Olympics or the World Cup, something along those lines? All of those are common instances where folks in the sport industry are conducting feasibility studies and essentially trying to gauge the financial feasibility of making a particular investment in either constructing a new sports facility or planning and coordinating a particular sport event. The why here is that these things are commonly used in our industry. So it's important that you, as a practitioner, have a sound understanding of some of the concepts surrounding conducting a feasibility study. So that's what we're going to focus on this week. All right, so I gave you this definition on the last slide, but I just want to repeat it real quick. So a feasibility study is a study conducted to determine whether a project is likely to be sensible or successful. So generally, feasibility studies are conducted in two phases. The first phase is really based on existing information or data, right? So in phase one, basically the parties involved, or the committee involved, is going to pull any secondary information they have. It could be census data, attendance statistics, ticket prices, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, phase one, they're looking to assess what information do we have that could help us determine whether or not this is a financially feasible thing to move forward on. Phase one will typically also employ some kind of exploration of potential sources of financing, like we talked about last week. So, exploring whether or not there's public or private forms of financing available. Looking at potential locations, like can we actually build this facility that we're looking to potentially build, and then just overall market demand in that area. Ultimately, phase one is really about deciding whether or not the committee should move forward and conduct a more in depth analysis. And you can see here, phase two is that more in depth analysis. Typically in phase two, you're collecting actual primary data, so data that doesn't exist yet but that you're gathering firsthand. So phase two has to be justified, right? Because it's going to be a little bit more costly to do that more in-depth analysis. But keep in mind that, before any committee or planning group gets to a phase two, they're going to have to make a pretty good justification in phase one that this seems like a feasible project to consider. All right, so I pulled this table from your textbook because I think it gives a really good overview of basically these four key components to a feasibility study. So you can see here a market demand analysis, which is really going to be our focus of the lesson today. We're going to focus on that particular component. But there are other aspects of conducting a feasibility study. So looking at location costs, and engineering analysis, gauging economic and fiscal impact of the project, and then finally a financing analysis, kind of getting into some of the things we looked at last week. But like I said, you can see all four of these kind of interact with one another and are really essential in order to determine whether or not a project is going to be financially feasible. All right, so I mentioned that the market demand analysis is really going to be what we focus on for our purposes, that we just don't have enough time to cover every component of the feasibility study, but that market demand analysis is essential in justifying or kind of making the case that the project itself will be financially feasible. So you can see these first four boxes up at the top are all market demand, and we're going to highlight each component here in the upcoming slides. But do make sure you take time to kind of review some of these other components that would also be included in a real-life feasibility report. Okay, so I already mentioned that the market demand analysis will be our focus. I just wanted to highlight really the four components that we're going to look at in more detail here this week. And, really, especially with these first two, individual ticket demand and corporate demand or corporate depth, those are going to be ones that do require some analysis on our part. So we're going to spend a lot of time with those. We'll highlight and introduce event activity and facility specs and operating estimates, but we're really going to focus on these first two, really measuring individual ticket demand and assessing corporate depth. Okay, let's start with that first one, estimating individual ticket demand. So as you can imagine, if you are trying to gauge the market demand in a particular community or metropolitan area, you probably want to be able to estimate what the ticket demand will be like in that area before you either build a new sports facility or bring a new sports team to that community, right? It's probably important to be able to predict what kind of demand there will be for tickets. Otherwise, of course, you're not generating revenue in ticket sales, and that's a problem when it comes to the financial feasibility, especially long term. So these are some of the key indicators of individual ticket demand, or rather pieces of information that you'd want to look at and analyze if you're trying to estimate individual ticket demand. So certainly population size, right? So you want to look at the size of the area, and of course on its face make sure that the population itself is large enough to be able to support, let's say, a professional sports team, right? Probably don't want to bring a professional sports team to a community that has a population that's less than what you could hold in a stadium or arena, right? So making sure the size of the population can justify bringing or building that facility. But really also wanting to look a little bit more in depth at the population. So not just looking at the static number of what's the population size today, but also looking at what's the population growth in this particular area and what has it looked like for, let's say, the last 3 to 5 years. Is this a community that people are moving to? Are they experiencing growth? Or are people leaving? Are they flooding out of the city? And that particular piece, population growth, is going to be a huge indicator into kind of the financial feasibility, specifically looking at individual ticket demand. We're going to look at how to calculate population growth here in the next few slides, but before we do that, just want to identify that there are some other demographic pieces of information that might be helpful in gauging individual ticket demand. So obviously you'd want to look at the age trends in the area. So you want to look at a breakdown of the probably adult age individuals and what their ages are. Of course, you want to take into account the particular league that the team is operating in here, right? You probably want to look at the key demographics in terms of the typical fan for this league. And then you'd want to analyze whether or not this particular city or area matches up with that, right? So if you are, you're a team within the MLS and you're looking to expand to a new city, you're probably going to want to compare the kind of average age fan of the MLS to this area. And I would imagine, I haven't looked at the data in a while, but I would imagine it's trends younger, right? Probably that 18 to 34-year-old range is a big chunk of their fans. So if you're looking at a city that has a high population of that particular age group, that's probably a good sign in estimating individual ticket demand. Income is another great demographic piece of information, right? And this one, again, while you can look at measures like median household income and try to predict whether or not a subset of that population can actually afford tickets to your games. This, of course, is just one factor, right? There are other factors that we'll talk about in a little bit, but gauging income levels can be helpful, right? Especially as you think of some sports that are especially expensive, right? Like NHL or NFL tickets, which trend a little higher. They would probably be a little bit more concerned if the income in a particular city had lower median household incomes. So all of these are helpful pieces of demographic information to look at when you are trying to predict individual ticket demand. All right, I said we would look a little closer at calculating population growth, and we do this by calculating compounded annual growth rate. Okay, so I'll walk you through this step by step so that you can see how to do it, because I think it is an important skill set to be able to gauge growth in a particular area over time, especially when you're calculating market demand. So I'm using the case city of Indianapolis, and we have two numbers here that will allow us to calculate compounded annual growth rate. We have the population size in 2010, which we can see here is about 1.72 million. And then we have population size in 2015, which is about 1.84 million. Keep in mind that this is all based on census data, and hopefully everyone in here took the census this past month or so, or past few months. We're going to have new census data here very soon, basically, once this 2020 census is out and calculated. So that will be good. A lot of the data we're operating with in the textbook is a little dated because we just haven't had that updated census data. So that'll be good. But for the purposes of this case, we have the 2010 data and the 2015 data. So this 5-year period, and we can calculate what the percentage of growth rate is over that time. Here's our formula. All you need to do to calculate CAGR is change in population divided by old population divided by the period of time or years. Okay, so let's look at this step by step. So change in population divided by old population. So first, in order to get change in population, we have to do some subtracting, right? We can see here we pulled the 1.84, oops, sorry, I have that wrong there, 1.844 million, that's the new population size, and we're subtracting the old population size, right? That's going to give us this number right here, which is the change in population. Okay, so all you're doing is subtracting there to get that. Once we have that, we need to pull our denominator, which is the old population, right? So what was our initial population here in 2010? It's this 1.729 million, okay? So if we go ahead and divide those two numbers, so we have our change in population, we're dividing it by the old population, we're going to get something like this. It's 0.066, okay? That tells us, if we stop there, that tells us what the growth rate is from 2010 to 2015, right? The overall change in that time. But we want to go a step further, right? We want to know the annual growth rate, right? So on an annual basis, what is the growth rate if we account for the period of time? So all we have to do is one more step is just divide that 0.066 divided by 5, which is the period of time in this case, right? The difference between those two. And then we get something like this, 0.013. Okay, this is our number before we've actually translated it into a percentage, right? So much like we did with our financial ratios, we're just going to multiply it by 100, and that's going to give us a percentage. So in this case, we can see that the compounded annual growth rate for Indianapolis over this time period is 1.3%. That means essentially each year Indianapolis is growing by 1.3%, okay? And again, by taking that extra step, we sort of can assess this more at an annual rate, which is important, right? If you're trying to gauge, change over time. And so if you were a sports team and you were looking at Indianapolis as a potential site to move a team or build a facility, you'd want to kind of track this growth rate. Now, of course, it's positive, right? That there has been growth over that time period. It's not a huge growth, right? 1.3% isn't massive growth rate, but it is something, and that would be one factor that you'd want to consider. But keep in mind that this is only one factor, right? We had identified some of those other ones on the last slide that would also be important to look at. You'd want to look at a comprehensive look at the demographics of a particular area. But certainly looking at compounded annual growth rate could be a helpful indicator. Oops. Okay. All right, so the next piece that we're going to look at here as part of a market demand analysis is estimating corporate demand, or corporate depth is how I'll typically refer to it. So corporate demand is essentially this measure of corporate demand for season tickets, club seats, luxury suites, and sponsorships. Okay. So you might be thinking, why is it important that we look at corporate demand in a particular city? Why does that matter? If we can look at, demographic information, we really want to see, people will buy tickets. Well, in sports, it's also really important that we have business-to-business clients that are going to purchase our tickets and that we can sell sponsorships to, right? So being able to gauge the corporate demand in a particular area in some cases is just as important as being able to sell tickets to individuals. So by estimating corporate demand, we can get a pretty good idea as to whether or not this area would be fruitful when it comes to selling luxury suites to corporations or selling sponsorships to corporations. So basically we need two pieces of information in order to calculate corporate depth, and we do this through a corporate depth analysis. First piece of information is how many companies are headquartered in the area, okay? And typically when you're measuring corporate depth this way, you look at Fortune 500 companies. And then how many sports teams are based in the area. If you have those two pieces of information, you can easily calculate corporate depth. All right, so in order to get a little practice here with corporate depth analysis, I'm going to let you pause, or if you want to just watch me do this, that's fine. Calculating corporate depth is really simple. Like I said, once you have the number of corporations in a particular city and the total number of sport franchises in that city, then you can calculate corporate depth, and all you have to do is divide, right? You divide the total franchises in that area. You take that out of the number of corporations, that gives you your corporate depth. So in this case, if you divide 9 by 12,120, that's going to give you 1,347. That gives us a corporate depth for City A of 1,347. Okay. We do the same for City B and City C. You can see City B, we have a corporate depth of 1,922. City C, we have a corporate depth of 1,585. Okay, again, all you're doing is dividing here, right? You've got your number of corporations, you're dividing by the number of franchises, that's going to give you your corporate depth. I think I said that backwards before, sorry. You start with your number of corporations, you divide that by the number of franchises, that gives you your corporate depth. Sorry, I did not get enough sleep last night. Okay, so once you've calculated the corporate depth for each of the cities that you're assessing, you might answer this question, right? Which market is likely a better fit for a sports league that is heavily reliant on corporate spending? So let's say that the feasibility study you're doing is within a league where they rely really heavily on that corporate spending. So this is really important. So if you were measuring corporate depth here, you would probably say, hey, City B is probably the best fit given the corporate depth, right? Because there are 1,922 corporations per team, which is quite a bit more than each of these other cities, City A and City C. Now, does that mean that 1,922 corporations are going to purchase sponsorships or naming rights or buy tickets from the team? No. But it does give us an indication of how many corporations might be a potential target for those kinds of conversations, right? And it's also important to note here that if we were just looking at the kind of total number of corporations here, we probably would have said, oh, City A looks great, right? City A's got the most corporations of any of these, so they would probably be great, right? But once we account for the fact that City A has a lot more professional sports franchises, pretty sure that's New York, than the others, then we see that by the time you divide that out, that there are much fewer corporations per team, right? And keep in mind that most companies, even if they're Fortune 500 companies, don't have a budget to buy sponsorships with every sports franchise in their city, right? So they're going to have to make decisions about where that spending occurs. So important to be able to assess corporate depth for that reason. Okay, you'll get a little bit more practice calculating corporate depth in your practice case for this week. All right, so far we've covered individual ticket demand and corporate demand. Again, really two important components to assessing whether or not there is actual market demand for a sports facility or sports team within an area. Now we're just going to quickly highlight these other two, event activity and facility specs and operating estimates. All right, so estimating event activity. So in this particular market demand analysis, we're trying to do a couple of things. One, we're trying to conduct a competitive analysis of the existing sports facilities in a particular area, right? So this question in red is really the key to estimating event activity, right? How might existing facilities compete with a new or proposed one, right? Obviously, in most major metropolitan cities here in the US, there are existing sport facilities or facilities that could potentially host sporting events or concerts or other events that a sporting facility might host. So, really important to do a competitive analysis of those facilities to determine whether or not there's even room in that area for a new facility, right? And there are essentially two different stakeholder groups here to assess. The first is, in terms of usage, the people that are actually showing up to events, right? So one way to gauge this is to look at, the rates of sellout for the different venues in town, whether it's for a sporting event or a concert or something else. So trying to gauge how many people are already showing up to the existing facilities and tracking those attendance numbers. And then the other key stakeholder group here is the actual event promoters who book the facility, right? Because obviously these people are tasked with getting events to sport facilities, whether it's some kind of monster truck rally or a concert. Oftentimes these days, sport facilities don't just operate for sporting events, right? They're trying to fill those non-game days with additional events. So incredibly important to gauge kind of what the event promoter situation is in that facility and whether or not the facility you're proposing could actually gain business. So those are a couple of things to consider when it comes to estimating event activity. And then finally, want us to look at facility specs and operating estimates. And ultimately, we're going to be able to predict or try to estimate a right-size facility after we're done. Okay, so another piece of a feasibility study in terms of market demand analysis is determining the size of a proposed facility. So here you can look at various pieces of information to help determine adequate size. So here I've listed a few things, right? So some things you'd want to account for, like overall square footage. When it comes to the seating area, how many seats are you going to have, how many suites you're going to have, how many open hospitality areas are you going to have, so on and so forth. You'd also want to account for things like concession areas and bathrooms, right? Obviously, very important. So all of these components are going to be assessed in this component or this piece of the market demand analysis. This question is an important one. Why is it important that we build a right size facility? And right size meaning that it's the right size or it's the optimal size to meet the demand for the particular events that are going to be held there. Why is this important? Well, if we don't build a facility that's optimally sized, then we could have an issue where we're underselling or overselling events, right? Meaning that the facility is too large to meet the demand, and the demand is so low that you can never sell it out, right? That's a problem. Or the facility is too small and there's constant wait lists for people to try to get into the facility. So really important to find kind of the optimal size given a series of information. Okay, so in order to estimate the optimal size of an arena, we can use what's called a population to capacity ratio, okay? We're going to apply that here to one of the examples in the book, which is the Sacramento Kings. And the Sacramento Kings did end up building a new facility. I think this book was published a few years before that. But the example they use in the book really identifies how to apply this population to capacity ratio for a team that's looking to build a new facility. Okay, so basically we need three pieces of information in order to estimate the optimal size of an arena. I keep saying arena, but it could be an arena or stadium. Okay, three pieces of information. One, we need the population of the subject of the feasibility study, right? So in this case, we need the population of Sacramento. We need the average capacity of comparable market stadiums or arenas, right? So we would need to find a comparable stadium or arena, so a similar size city as Sacramento in the league, and we'd want to find out what the average capacity was across a 41 home game season, okay? Should be fairly easy to find. Population of comparable markets, right? So once we have the actual ticket sale data, we just need to know the population of the comparable markets. And again, a comparable market should be comparable in size to whatever our subject city is. So we'd want to find population that's similar to Sacramento. Okay, if we have those three pieces of information, we can estimate the optimal size of an arena. So let's do that now. All right, so I told you those were the three pieces of information we need, and voila, we have them. Okay, so I like to put these particular problems in a table like this. I think it's just a little bit easier to see, but you feel free to do it any way you'd like. I'll just take you step by step here. So in order to calculate or estimate optimal size, we have to start by calculating the population to capacity ratio. So we do this by taking the average 30-mile population of the comparable markets, which we have here. Okay, so we've identified comparable markets to Sacramento. This is the average 30-mile population. Okay, and then we divide that by the average capacity of those comparable markets across a 41-game season. So we have ticket sale data. We know that over a 41-game home season, that comparable market sold about 760,000 tickets. Okay, so if we run that equation, then we should get our rate of population to capacity, which here is 2.03 if we divide those. Okay, now that we have this ratio, we can apply it to Sacramento's population, right? So we have Sacramento's population here, which again is comparable to the comparable market, right? So all we have to do here is divide Sacramento's 30-mile population by our rate of population to capacity, right? If we do that, that's going to give us 854,071, okay? So you can see here we have Sacramento's capacity based on the population to capacity ratio. So this, in theory, is how many tickets Sacramento Kings would sell if we're basing it on what this comparable market did, right? So that's for the 41-game season. Obviously, that's not too helpful yet, right? We want to know the optimal size of an arena. So what do? Well, we divide that by the 41 games, right? And that's going to give us the optimal size of an arena at a 100% sold out rate, meaning that every seat is full in the arena. So if we do that, we divide the 854,000 by 41, we get 20,831. That means that if we are using this population to capacity ratio, if we're using this comparable data to try to predict optimal size of an arena, 100% sellout rate for the Sacramento Kings would be 20,831. So if we were using 100% sold out rate, we would build a facility that had 20,831 seats. Typically, when you are estimating optimal facility size, you also want to calculate at a 90% sold out rate, right? So that you have a couple different numbers to work with. So for a 90% sold out rate, we just multiply this, the 100% by 0.90. That will give us our 90% sellout rate of 18,748. This gives the feasibility study team some numbers to work with, right? And there could be a number of factors that dictate whether or not they go with the facility size at a 100% sellout rate or a 90% sellout rate, right? And they can look at their past attendance data to try to help predict that. But anyway, we were able to utilize comparable data, right? Comparable market data for both population and attendance to get to what we think would be an optimal size of an arena for the Sacramento Kings. Hopefully that made sense. I know that one's got several steps to it. You will get some more practice with your practice case this week. Okay, that was a kind of a very quick overview of the market demand analysis component of a feasibility study. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, there are other elements or components to a full feasibility study, and I'm listing those here. Financing, something that we spent quite a bit of time on last week in terms of assessing the various sources of financing. Certainly that's a key component to a feasibility study, right? Determining different sources of financing and whether or not it could actually be constructed is obviously key, right? So knowing whether or not those financing sources are in place is key. Location is another key component of a feasibility study. So looking at some of the elements I've listed here, like what is it going to actually cost to purchase land to build a facility on? Based on where that land is it close to, the general population? Are they going to have issues getting there with public transportation? Is that an option? All of those issues would want to be ironed out in this component of the feasibility study. And then finally, some kind of more nitty gritty details regarding actually constructing and engineering the facility. Obviously, you're going to be contracting out a lot of that work, but getting estimates and trying to put a cost to a lot of those things is going to be important part of this feasibility study. Okay, one last thing I just want to mention, because I know that the textbook and my lecture focus heavily on professional sport. And the textbook in particular focuses heavily on men's professional sport. I do want to note that this concept of a feasibility study can be applied to really any aspect or sector of the sport industry, right? We see it all the time on the recreation side of things. So it goes far beyond professional sports stadiums and arenas. It could be anything from parks, swimming pools, youth sport facilities or complexes. We see a lot of, local metropolitan areas, conducting feasibility studies for building facilities like that. So the principles are very similar, right? Some of the things we've looked at here are going to also apply for feasibility studies applied to other sectors of the industry. I just want to mention that because I know that our conversation focused heavily on the professional side of things. Okay, that's all I have on feasibility studies. I know that was quick. I tried to keep it fairly brief and to the point because we have other content to look at this week. But you will get some more practice applying some of those market demand analysis components in your practice case this week. All right, thanks.